So our speaker tonight is Dr. Mike Russo. Mike's an archaeologist with the National Park Service and is stationed at the Southeastern Archaeological Center, which is in Tallahassee. He's worked on sites throughout the southeastern U.S., exploring the rise of monumental construction, social complexity, ceremonialism, and settled life during the Archaic period, 7,000 to about 3,000 years ago, and the Woodland period, 3,000 to about 1,000 years ago. In South Florida, he's worked on the Horse Island Archaic Mound and Village Complex near Marco Island, and on the Reed Shell Ring near Stewart on the East Coast. Some of his recent work is found in books entitled Science of Power, The Rise of Cultural Complexity in the Southeast, and Early Pottery, Technology, Function, Style, and Interaction in the Lower Southeast. The last 3 years, Mike's worked at the Tyndall Air Force Base on the Panhandle, exploring Weeden Island and Swift Creek settlement patterns. And tonight, his talk is going to talk a little bit about some of his discoveries up there, looking for some lost mounds that C.B. Moore investigated back in the early 1900s. And so with that, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Mike Russo.
Thanks, Bob. I'm with the National Park Service. I'm an archaeologist. Somebody earlier asked me what my title was. My title is archaeologist. That's all we have in the Park Service. So we don't have regional archaeologists. We don't have director of archaeology. It's just archaeologist. I'm in a small division in SEAC. SEAC normally takes care of all the national parks. They run the archaeology for them. They curate the artifacts. But I'm in a very small division consisting of 4 people where all we do is help other people. People come to us, agencies come to us, say, hey, can you do this? And we say yes. It's a great job. So if you have anything you want us to do, you come to us. If we don't do it to your liking, you call your congressman, say, hey, he's congressionally mandated to help us. It's a great job, and recently, Tyndall Air Force Base has come to us in the last 5 or 10 years and asked us to help them out with their archaeology. Specifically, they've had a continuing problem in that every time they want to build something or cut down a tree, the State Historic Preservation Office has said, wait a minute, C.B. Moore's mound somewhere in that general vicinity. We know it's there somewhere. And so go out and do some archaeology, or build it, or don't build it, or build it somewhere else. And they've hired archaeologists to go out and find these mounds. And all told, probably 5 different archaeologists have looked for these 8 mounds of C.B. Moore's. They're on Tyndall property. And nobody's ever found one, with one possible exception. And when they came to us, they told us the problem. We saw that they really needed to get a handle on this problem. So we came up with a couple research plans. We were bound and determined to find these mounds no matter what. Now, having done this, and I'll give you a little prefatory statement here, it would be nice just to go to somebody and ask them, hey, where are these mounds? We didn't know anybody. When we were all done with these searches, Nancy White came up to me and said, hey, I know somebody who knows all about those mounds. So we spent all this effort looking for them, and it's good effort. And this guy, Herman Jones, a local collector, took us to a couple of them right after that. And I'm glad he confirmed our locations. And so if we had just found him a little earlier, it would have been better. But we did find a couple that he didn't know about either. So it all worked out. And we appreciate Nancy's and Herman's help. So are we going to kill the lights? Is that the idea? I think they're great. And these are the mounds we're talking about. There's 8 that C.B. Moore found in 1902 and 1918. He made 2 visits there. And he visited a couple of them twice, especially the hair hammocks. We'll end with the hair hammock mounds. And I'm just going to kind of tell you about our endeavors to find these, why there was problematic, why previous archaeologists had problems with finding them, and how they kind of dovetailed into another project I was interested in, talking about rings and ring middens. This is C.B. Moore's earliest map of the Tyndall Air Force Base Peninsula, starting from about here, goes around here, and over to here. And you can see in 1902, he found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the mounts he described, and 1 was on Davis Point. right at the end of Tyndall. This is a more modern map. This is when he described on Davis Point. We were bound to determine, to begin with, we said, well, we're not going to be able to find that one, and we're not going to be able to find Farmdale. These two were subsequently inhabited by two historic communities, which in 1940, when the Air Force took over, they brought in bulldozers, raised all the communities, leveled the ground, and I said you could spend millions looking for these mounds, and the millions would be spent in cataloging all your historic artifacts, so you might want to avoid those. So they've decided on their own just not to build around here, and they have no pressing need to locate those mounds. So we went up to Davis Point to find that one first. One of them, I've heard that I cannot go back on this. There we go. Well, there you go. Okay. So there's two mounds up here. One, the Davis Point he found in boy, I'm just not having any luck with this. He found in 1902. The other one he came back in 1918. Now these locations are not C.B. Moore's locations, but they're Gordon Willie's, who came in and did a compendium of all the sites in northwest Florida and along the Gulf Coast. And he said, here's where C.B. Moore landed. Here's where the state thinks these mounds are. Here's where I think they are, according to his descriptions. And so he placed here, and they've been looking for this mound, the Davis East Mound, for years, BY8. So we got a plan together. We looked at the historic records. We found out who the property owner that C.B. Moore mentioned was, a Mrs. Curvin. And we looked at the historic records to see where Mrs. Curvin lived, trying to narrow the property where that mound might be at. And we couldn't find anything on a Curvin in this neck of the woods. So we deferred to the state. The state put the mound right there. And C.B. Moore said it was a mile northwest of Davis Point. So now here's, this whole thing's kind of called Davis Point, and we didn't know where in there C.B. Moore thought Davis Point was. So it's kind of an arbitrary decision where you think logical place is Davis Point he might have measured from. And so we just measured, we noticed that the SHPO measured from this point, thinking that was Davis Point. We put in a few alternative possibilities that this might be Davis Point. And we just drew a mile arc out there and said, well, here's the survey areas we're going to hit. We knew right here that this area had been surveyed, so the likelihood of these guys not running over that in 1979 and 1884 was kind of puzzling, because they were in this neck of the woods. But we thought, well, we'll survey this area first, then we'll survey that one. And we kind of prioritized where we thought the most likely was based on his description. But then, while we were doing the historic search, one of our crew members noticed that, hey, here's his 1902 map that has Davis Point here. And over here, the 1918 map in which he found the site has Davis Point over here. And we did our little background search, and we figured, oh yeah, we reread Willie, we reread Moore, and we discovered that no archaeologists had recognized this, although tons had read about it. They just accepted Willie's word for it, but the mound wasn't even on Tyndall property. It was off-site near Panama City. So that was nice. That was off our plate, although we spent a lot of time doing historic research. And this is where we moved it from there to there, problem solved. So the next, I think we went after the next one, was we started planning for this one. We knew the property owner was Joseph Massalina, and we found some property records where Joseph Massalina had property. The tricky part about this was, and C.B. Moore says it's 300 yards in from the coast on property of Joseph Massalina. So you do that, it could be anywhere 300 yards in here from the coast. The problem is that Joseph Massalina kind of claimed he owned the whole area. So we're not sure it was really on his formerly owned property or property he claimed he owned. But anyway, we went through the same process. Well, here's our plan. We can do it. 4 archaeologists had been to this site and couldn't find it. They had this wide area they had surveyed intensively and drawn a boundary. They found an archaeology site here, but not the mound. And so we had an intricate plan here. We're going to do transects there. We're going to transect in a little corner. This is all wetlands. I didn't want to do transects there. I didn't think it was up there. This is all kind of high uplands. It's too far away from the coast, but we would run out of room. Everybody already surveyed this area. So then this was a golf course also. And so, well, maybe we can do cores along the fairways. And it was getting to be a nightmare. It's going to be a big project. And Oh, let me go back a little. And then this is kind of out of sequence. At the end of our project, we're all done. We're getting ready to do this. Nancy introduces us to Herman. He goes, I know where that is. And he goes, it's right here. And he points. We walked us right to there, and it was smack dab right there. It was not very recognizable as a mound, and I could see how other archaeologists had missed it. But he had a corporate memory that it was more mounded in the past, and that he had seen bulldozers go in there and take out fill for road fill, that kind of stuff. And we just looked on the ground, we could see that it was an active area. So that's probably the area it is. But we talked Tyndall out that they just need to identify that as a spot, and we didn't have to go back there. There was probably a big midden. BY9 is a big one. That's BY7, the mound. BY9 is probably a big midden, and it may have been circular, and they dug a reservoir right in the middle of it. So I don't think we'll ever find out if that was a circular ring. So we're working our way down. We get rid of those two, so it's been easy so far. And then we can come up to Strange and Baker. And our goal was to find two mounds at Strange's Landing and Baker's Landing. This is how they were described. We assumed they were owned by people called Strange and people called Baker. All we had on the map were two spots called Baker's Point and Strange's Point. And so using that and the map by Moore, Willie on a very large scale plotted the likely locations of these two mound sites. The state, because this scale was so big, plotted it over here. I'm not sure why, right in the middle of a cantonment area that had been leveled to the ground. But every time they were trying to build over here at a new building, they wanted to go to survey this again. Although it's been surveyed a dozen times, there's nothing there. And so it's just constant. You could blow that off, and we found that if you blow it off, say, look, we surveyed it, it's clear. It said, well, then maybe it's over here. So we could never get rid of that. We had to find this mound, or these guys would have this regulatory requirement every time they went out trying to build something. So we, using the description by Moore that Strange's Mound was 1/2 mile east or due west of Strange's Landing, we looked at a couple likely areas. Was the Strange Point Strange's Landing? If it was, this is a 1/2 mile. That might be the best way to go, from that little triangle there, if you can see it. If it was here, because we saw an old dock there, an old ferry dock on a 1920s map, then maybe this would be the area to survey. If it was here at the mouth of Strange's Bayou, then this would be the best area to survey. And if it's somewhere down here near the mouth of the Strange's Bayou, this would be the best area. And so we calculate our likelihood of finding survey area in terms of priority: survey area 1, then 2, then 3. Over here, we didn't want to get over here because they were running airplanes and constructing stuff, and that was a real nightmare. So we were hoping we'd find it in area 1 or 2. Coincidentally, the CRM person on board said, hey, I looked at an aerial and I found some shell right here. So he got our vote. We went out there. We're going to do that survey area 1 first. And this is what we did. We set up a grid pattern. We did a systematic grid over it. And we found something, but not a mound. We found this arc-shaped midden. So we jumped over and did survey area 2. Didn't find anything over there either. It was an interesting midden in that when we plotted out the shell that we found in our shovel test, we got kind of an arc shape. When we plotted out the midden soil, we got an arc shape. But when we really plotted out the ceramic numbers and weight, we got a circular shape. And this is a classic ring midden shape with a central plaza lacking shell, bone, artifacts. And this was a classic description of a ring midden, a Weeden Island ring midden that had been hypothesized to exist in 1974 by Brose and Percy as the archetype settlement pattern for the region, although at the time they didn't have any evidence for it direct. And here we plotted on top of our topography, and there's a good correlation between the high topography and at least one arm of the ring midden. After we went to Baker's, and I'm getting a lot of sequence, we gave up on finding the mound. We'd gone everywhere. We did area 1 and 2. We came back and did the transit map, and I started walking in the woods. And this was the last transit we did. This was the last shovel test we did prior, and that's how we found the ring. And these were all negative shovel tests, 100 meters of negative shovel tests. And then I looked up, because I hadn't been out there. The guys were digging it. I hadn't seen it before. I looked up, and there was the mound sitting right there. So we went back. We did a little survey on that. And this is a classic description, at least by Willie, or not Willie, but by Moore, that he would go into a mound, he would place a trench through the middle or hit the east side real heavy to see this is where the stashes of pottery. He was after pottery mostly. Now, I don't know if it's true. What I think is happening on many of these mounds, and you'll see the pictures of this, is that although he describes that, what he typically did was dig a trench through the middle, and somebody else read that he dug the east side. That's where the good stuff was, and later they'd come in and dig the east side of the mound. And I think all these east side disturbances we see, they could be Willie's, or Moore's. I can't prove one way or the other, but some of them have lots of historic artifacts in them, and it's obviously they're just reading Moore and copying his description of what a mound should look like. But this was a nice mound. We were surprised because most of Moore's mounds, he says, I destroyed them. He went to once or twice and we leveled them. But we're finding a lot of them have pretty good high spots that don't seem to be disturbed, but once we dig into them, they are disturbed. But we're kind of curious why they are recontoured into the mound shape. We don't know the reason for that. If somebody later did it, some land manager, or if they were just conscientious and tried to backfill their holes. If anybody knows, you let me know, but I haven't read that that was his pattern. But all of them seem to be recontoured into a mound shape, or many of them at least half of them, let's say. What we found in here, and our idea was, as soon as you hit human remains, quit, call the CRM on base, because we're not responsible, and he will call the coroner or the medical examiner, and they'll come out and do their work and then go through the system. We came out here and we hit a couple teeth, and you can let teeth bypass because they could lose them accidentally. And we hit bone fragments, but we didn't hit any positive human remains. But what we did hit was a red slipware, sheets of mica, and a couple other artifacts that are typical of ceremonial mounds. So we just gave up. We didn't dig the whole trench. We gave up and just dug part of the way down into these. We had enough to confirm what we thought that this was the mound, that it was right over here. That's exactly 1/2 mile due west of that point right there. And that point today, the locals call Stranger's Landing. Not on any map, but that's what they call it. So now, just as an aside, Herman Jones, Nancy's friend, had been looking for Stranger's Mound for years, and he had actually found this mound. But he didn't think it was Stranger's Mound. He thought Stranger's Mound was right at the end of this runway right there. So he took us out there, and we did dig into a pile, and it turned out to be a push pile. There's a road nearby. So I haven't talked to Herman yet, but I have to show him our evidence for this and convince him that I think we have it. But in the middle of this, when we gave up, we went looking over to Baker's point, and we had the same thing over here. But instead of a 1/2 mile distance, he described it, the mound site being a 1/4 mile distance. So if that's Baker's Landing, or if that's Baker's Landing, or if that's Baker's Landing, the mound should be a 1/4 mile from it. And Willie put his mound right there. In 1979, the first professional survey of Tyndall Air Force Base was conducted by Knutson out of FSU. And these guys Tyndall went into survey archaeology, kicking and screaming. And they gave him permission to walk the shores, but he couldn't dig a shovel test. And so he could pick up artifacts if he saw them on the surface, and that was it. That's all they let him do. So he found shell on the surface here, and he knew it wasn't a mound, but he thought there was some either mounds in here or some push piles somewhere in here around it. And so he circled the shell midden and labeled it BY29. So now we have a confusion. Is BY29 a mound or is it a shell midden? And that confusion persisted. In 1984, another surveyor came in after Knutson. They did the same thing. They found the same shell deposit, I think. They kind of circled it. They put in maybe 2 or 3 shovel tests and estimated the limits of it, and that's what they found. In 2005, another surveyor come in looking for the mound, and they expanded the boundaries a little. But again, they didn't go much beyond the area that had been discovered in 1979 by Knutson, and all they found was shell. So we went in there, bound and determined to find it. We did a systematic survey test over all this. And on this row, as it comes obvious, we run right into the mound. And this mound was not a pretty picture. We had a trench going right through the middle of it. And we had, I'll show you in a minute, we had lots more disturbance over on this side, this wall. And this happens to be, because Herman Jones had visited this one too, he told us later, and he had dug right in here, and he had collected Swift Creek pottery, not Weedon Island, but Swift Creek pottery, and he had reconstructed a pot from broken bits of pottery, all collected from right on the east side of the mound, the spoil pile. And if you look in the Moore book, all he got from this mound was one Swift Creek sherd, and it seems to be the one that Herman Jones is missing from his pot. So that was enough evidence for us that we found Moore's mound. But we did open that trench up to see if we could tell if it was disturbed, and boy was it disturbed. Somewhere in the 1950s, the Air Force who owned it then must have been the culprits, went in there and dug big trenches in here, and they dumped tin cans and Coke bottles out the kazoo right in here. So they destroyed almost all this. This is all disturbed. There's not an in situ piece of sand left in that mound. And the rest of the mound, we dug one more unit in the rest of the mound, and even in the area we thought was less disturbed, but even it was disturbed all the way down. Not nearly as much, but all the soils were mottled and hardly any artifacts in it whatsoever. But that was enough to have Herman's pot and a location. That was good enough for us. But interestingly, this is one of the mounds. In all these mounds that Moore mentions, he always says there's a living area nearby. By living area or a dwelling area, he thought that shell in great abundance or dark soils with shell and crappy pottery in it were living areas. And he was right on about that. But he didn't go beyond that. He might occasionally put a shovel test in the one and say, I had no good pots here, and move on. But this is why I was doing the survey. You know, we were helping this Tyndall out, but I wanted to find out what these rings were, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But this survey area here revealed a circular ring midden. This is the topography of it. This is what the bone distribution looked like. Shell distribution and ceramic distribution, all revealed a circular ring. These are all midden constituents with a central plaza in it. It had been disturbed quite a bit. It had been disturbed in 1902 in Moore's time. And so it's been disturbed even more. And these rises here are minuscule. They're maybe 10, 20 centimeters tops rising above the surface of the ground on the outside. Let me see if I can get back to this. Dang. Okay, I'll get it. See if I can see this. These guys had actually, we knew there was supposed to be a ring enclosure, shell enclosure is what Moore called it. It's supposed to be in here. So these guys were tasked to do a contour map to see if they could find it. But I think what they did some bogus GPS elevation reading kind of map. And this is not even what the slope looks like, as our contour map shows, and they totally missed it. You can't see it on the ground. You've got to have a real fine-tuned instrument to make it apparent to you. So we're doing pretty good. We're going through the mounds one by one, and in the interim, we're finding nice ring middens, which was my hidden interest in all of this. So we're going to go down to the large and small mounds at Hare Hammock. These are the most problematic, and that's why I saved them for last, although we started on them first. Moore had mentioned that 400 yards from the end of this bay was the larger mound, was the smaller mound, which we think might be here, the end of the bay being down here. And then 400 yards northwest of that smaller mound was the large mound. And for years, people had thought this was the location of the large mound. There's a mound there. It's labeled as the large mound in the SHPO records. So we decided, from this, can we do the systematic survey, cover the entire area, and find the smaller mound? Again, archaeologists had been there and had not found it. This is our Red Cross, not theirs. They dug one shovel test there and one shovel test there. And that's all they could do in 1984 because that's all they had the money for. They walked around, they kind of defined the boundaries of the shell, but they didn't have any insight into where the smaller mound might be, if this was indeed the larger mound. They did note here there was a disturbance on this side, which is critical later. In 2005, another firm came in they defined this large ring as the former, this is the ring that the 1984 crew defined. They kind of narrowed it down. And they did this by walking what they saw as the circumference, finding a positive test, and then if they got a negative test outside of it, they would put a boundary line there. So you can see all these are positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. Ultimately, I think they only put like 8 shovel tests in this enormous site. And they did put one in the mound, like these guys put 1 shovel test in the mound, and they both recovered nothing. They said, the 1979 crew said about the mound that they couldn't tell if it's a mound or disturbed. They couldn't tell if it's BY30 or BY31, the smaller mound, so they called it they called this whole kit and caboodle BY3031. Now that's convenient for them, but it's a nightmare, an absolute nightmare for management purposes. We've got a record on file that says there's a mound here, it's BY30 and there's one BY31. And so how can you ever get clearance on this if you have this combined site, and we've never successfully found BY31, but that site number is in that name of that site. It's very problematic, causing no ends of headaches. And these guys kind of followed suit. They put 1 test pit, found nothing in the test pit in the mound, and they thought that it was a reconstructed mound, and I think they're right. It was reconstructed because I don't think more would have left it in this condition. And they said it may have been used for 3 possibilities: a Mississippi Temple mound, kind of a copy of that, or it might have been a staging area for timbering activities or for military activities. And we went in and we did a topo map of the mound. And this is how Moore described the mound: 4 foot high, flat top, like a Mississippi, and what we now know as a temple mound. And he says it was in pristine shape at the time, which is kind of confusing because he also said it was full of modern historic burials. And that he actually, when he dug in 1902, he left this half of the mound untouched because there were still modern historic burials in it. He found Weeden Island pottery. It's definitely a Weeden Island mound. Willie confirmed that. But when we did our topo map, you can see that the size of this is quite substantially larger diametrically than this mound, and certainly the height has been reconstructed. We haven't done volume studies, but it might be that the volume is the same as the volume here, and some land manager has gone back in and reconstructed it for some purpose. We dug in 3 shovel tests. Oh, let me see if I can get beyond that. Yeah. Oh, here's another issue. I'll come back to our shovel test right after this. How they've been treating this mound in Tyndall is as a historic cemetery. Not because C.B. Moore mentioned that there was historic burials in this mound, because he also mentioned that a hall had been removed. But sometime in the interim between 1918 and 1940, when the Air Force took over this, there's a record of 2 burials being placed in a mound in the Hare Hammock. And in 1950s sometime, the Air Force came in and put 4 posts and a fence around where they thought the burials were. Why they thought they were there, we're not at all clear. All we have is this mound in the 50s, or this map in the 50s claiming it. When we measure off from where that is, that's where the square ends up, right on top of the mound, or half in the mountain, half off of it. So our idea was to put in, based on the GPR, we did ground penetrating radar to see if there's any burial vaults or any signature that might indicate historic burials, and we're going to see if historic burials were in here. And so we dug 3 units. And in the first unit, we found nothing. Disturbed soils, we found a broken pot, Weeden Island pot, nicely incised but poorly degraded. Over here in 2, we found bottle caps in the top, a couple layers, and then nothing to about 100 centimeters where we found a tooth. And then over here, we found lots and lots and lots of historic Dinty Moore cans and bottles, and lots of that stuff in the top 30. And in there, broken fragments of bone and teeth, and one of them was definitively human. So we quit. We called the base. They called the medical examiner. And it was kind of funny because we had a bag of bone about, that big. And we're out in the middle of the woods, and they sent out an ambulance. And they were bringing out a body bag into the woods. So I go, "What are you doing?" And I just hand them this little bag. But, so that went through the whole rigmarole. There was some confusion. The medical examiner thought this was a human, this was definitely a prehistoric mound. And so the forensic anthropologists, so they used that. They couldn't definitively say this was prehistoric human remains, but they kind of leaned that way. Said it probably is because it's a prehistoric mound. And our whole point was we're going to try and prove, is it prehistoric mound or is it a historic burial mound? We didn't know. So that didn't help any. So I threw it to another forensic anthropologist, Dave Dickel, and he said, yeah, you can't tell from this stuff. And that was good. And then we had our own in-house guy look at it and say, yeah, you can't tell. And then Glenn Doran looked at it, yeah, you can't tell. So we're back to square one. Is it a prehistoric mound or is it a historic burial mound? We didn't know. So we had to explore another avenue. Having done that grid, if you remember that grid, that's where the mound was. Right up here, that's the mound we were just looking at. And we did a grid all the way down here, systematically every 20 meters, crisscross, crisscross. And this is the map we get for shell. So Moore had mentioned that near this mound to the northwest was a dwelling area, 85 meters. To the northwest now, and you saw it in the next slide, is a highway. And there's no midden up there. But to the west, or to the east, there's definitely midden in this area. So it's a little bit still not, we're not confirming, that's not confirmation of Moore's description of this as being the mound we're looking for. But 400 meters or 366 meters, 400 yards this way, the other mound, if this was the big mound, the mound should be in this area. And you can notice here, there's an empty space there with no shell. There's an empty space here with no shell. So we did a distribution chart just like we did to the other sites of the ceramics. And you can see up here we get lots, all the pottery shows that there's two hot spots, one here, one down here, just where you saw where the shell was in the back. I'm going to get the hang of this. The shell was there a hot spot down here, but a little different than the hot spot we find in the ceramic distribution. There was a linear hot spot here. But at any rate, all the pottery up here, 90% of it is Weeden Island. We have a few Swift Creek sherds. All the pottery down here was Swift Creek, and then there's a few Swift Creek sherds up here. So this kind of gives us this plaza formation again. We got a plaza down here, that's an empty spot in there, very small plaza, probably because it's been disturbed at Heckenbeck, and definitely a ring up here, and all indications are it's a Weeden Island ring. And a big one. It's probably the biggest one ever found on the Northwest Florida coast. It's about 250 meters across. We overlaid it onto the shell, of course, and there's not a great concordance, but the distribution of the pottery in the shell matches pretty good with a few outliers, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the Weeden Island distribution of pottery matches pretty good the shell distribution also, but we still have that empty spot right there, which is exactly where the mound should be. So after Nancy introduced me to Herman and we were getting ready to come out here, I went through our records, our shovel test. We had sent a crew out again. I said, well, maybe we didn't go far enough. Do a little more digging, because our survey ended right about there, right about where we thought the mound would be. We ran out of money. The next year we had a little more, so we did a little more probing, a few millimeter shovel tests in here to kind of fill out the grid, and we still didn't find it. But I looked at the past shovel test that the crew had done, and in a shovel test right there, one that was right there, it said on there, hey, small mound to the west. Who knew? Our shovel test had unfortunately been one there, one there, one there, one there. This is a 12-meter mound, 20-meter interval. You do the math. We missed it. So we went back, and I expect this is where I was going to walk and show where I thought Herman was going to, where our idea was, and then Herman walked right there and said, here it is. So we were both on the same page, and we should have called him a year earlier, saved a lot of trouble. It didn't look much like a mound. In 1902, what really sets us off as a mound is the view from this. You can't tell it's a mound from this side. It's almost level with the land. This is a few centimeters taller. But from the quarry pit, what we think is a quarry pit, you get a nice view, and it has a good aspect as a mound. Obviously on the east side, again, disturbance. We got a road here adding to the disturbance. But in 1902, Moore described this as an oval-shaped 45-foot long mound by 30. And then he returned in 1918. He said the land had been cleared. It had gone in cultivation a couple of years, and now it was laying fallow. And he found a 25-foot mound instead. He didn't describe it very well, assuming it's oval or diametrical. And to the west was a dwelling area in the woods to the west. We did find a very old fence line, barbed wire fence line. We're wondering if this is a property, this is Harrison's property, and this is a different guy's property. And we think that might be the fence line, a few posts. So that's what we concluded, that we got a Swift Creek ring here, here's the mound, we got dates on all this stuff. And what's very confusing, this looks like a big complex of mound and ring complex, but none of these dates are contemporaneous. Looks like this ring was occupied first, then this ridge of shell, then after that came this ring, and then after that came this burial mound. Where this mound fits, we're not really sure. We don't have a date on it. We're out of money, but we have datable stuff. We have found only Swift Creek pottery in there, but more, and Willie's description of Moore's pottery suggests this is a Weeden Island mound. But if you read more closely, he says that he found all these Weeden Island pots not in the mound, but 10 foot out over this way. So don't know what the answer is, but the few shovel tests we put in there, nothing but Swift Creek is coming out. So this seems to be a Swift Creek Weeden, and there's some discussion now that Swift Creek evolved into Weeden Island in this neck of the woods. This is a pretty good evidence that they're living side by side, if not on top of each other. Alternatively, it just could be coincidence, but we did find a few Swift Creek up here, Swift Creek sherds. And that's our last picture. Here's where the what our final assessment is, that this is a mound / burial mound. We don't know for sure, but Herman did point out to us again, we walked across this little road over here, and right over here, there are what appears to be 2 graves. And there's supposed to be 2 graves in this mound, historic graves. And these are graves covered with brick. We didn't have the authority to dig them or investigate them any further. But my guess is that Tyndall in 1953 decided they, under regulatory requirements, they had to protect all the historic cemeteries. They had a list of 11, and this Aries cemetery was on their list, and it was in Hare Hammock. This seemed like logic. It's a mound, for God's sake. It's got to be a burial. They put up a fence. They protected it. And so that's why they were, that's my guess. And that the actual burial mound is, ground is down here with the 2 graves in it. Okay. Now, as I've mentioned going along here, we were willing to help these guys. I was willing to help them. I was glad to help them. My expertise is not Weeden Island. I was asked at dinner today what I thought the earliest Weeden Island mound was, flat top mound was, and I said, boy, you tell me. I haven't been doing this long. I've been concentrating on archaic. The first site I ever dug was the McKeithen site, right over here, on a field school. I was an English major. I took that, and I was hooked. But after that, 20 years ago, I'd never seen a Weeden Island site again until I entered into Tyndall and had this project where it required me to get up to date on Weeden Island middens and settlement patterns. And as you can see here, this is the settlement pattern, the typical settlement pattern we found, a circular ring with a mound nearby. This is your settlement pattern here at Weeden Island, and you know more about this than I do, but it doesn't seem to me, you've got an arc shape, but the arc shape seems to be following the coastline rather than an intentional construction circling a plaza. It just doesn't seem to be the same thing, and look at the size of it. This is monstrous. Now these may be little circular middens here with plazas, and I think somebody's hypothesized that on one of them. But I think the evidence is out on here on what your settlement pattern in Weeden Island really is and how you can compare it to these other sites. The famous Kolomoki site had mounds and then the ring kind of connecting the mounds. So these mounds are kind of inside the ring rather than the outside and separate like ours are. And the McKeithen is very similar to the Kolomoki in that shape. That is, the midden seems to be in between mounds, multiple mounds, rather than a single mound on the outside of the ring. So I couldn't look to other sites to see what the Weeden Island settlement pattern was in terms of mounds and villages and those kinds of issues, because these didn't seem to match the pattern that I was finding topographically or in terms of artifact distribution. But I had dug archaic shell rings, and they seem to match quite closely in terms of the size, the horizontal size and the shapes. And I dug quite a few, and there's quite a few more archaic shell rings than there are Weeden Island ring middens. And That's the distribution of those. Recently we found a bunch. I first found the first ring midden we found in Florida was over here on Horace Island. I did that for my dissertation. Margo Schwartz has been working in here, and virtually every big shell site out here has a ring midden attached to it. And I'll show you pictures of this. I don't think I have them in the next slide, but I'll show them to you towards the end. So we thought, and there seems to be continuity, at least in Southwest Florida, that the archaic ring midden tradition evolved into the woodland ring midden tradition, which then exploded after that. Once they started building ring middens in the woodland down in Southwest Florida, they went whole hog, and they just started doing enormous shell works. And I think the ring middens got brushed aside, and they got taken out of the traditions thereafter as new ones developed. But the common things between late archaic coastal traits, this is why I thought I could use this as an example. And you can see the only thing that changed was the title. These are all similarities between the two traditions. This is an aerial view just to give you an idea what shell rings, archaic shell rings do look like. There's a couple shapes, generally circular like this, C-shaped or U-shaped like that. And this is a monster over here. I'll have another picture of it for you in a minute. It's got a ring shape, a circular there, another a C shape here. It's got a monster, the world's tallest shell ring right here. I wish it was in the picture, but we got a better topo map of it, which I'll show you later. But these are the general shapes of wooden archaic rings versus the woodland rings down here that are common in Florida but common nowhere else, and particularly in Northwest Florida. There's a few on the East Coast, one or two on the East Coast. But you can see that generally speaking, the shapes are similar. If you compare, the larger shapes are pretty similar, 250 meters across. That is the size, and the shapes are U-shaped and C-shaped. And they're generally 50 to 100 meters, most of them that have been found to date, with these monsters now being found on Tyndall, which are 250. And this is a map I had made before I had, these are all the known rings about 3 years ago. And we've since found 4 more on Tyndall. And these are the Weeden Island. This is the best studied one, the third Gulf Breeze. I'll have another picture of that a little later. I want to get these names on. Bird Hammock is a swift creek. It's very, I'll show you another picture of this later. It's a swift creek, and this is good evidence that Swift Creek involved the Weeden Island, because it's a Swift Creek deposit here largely, but Weeden Island Mound nearby, and a Swift Creek deposit nearby too. These are all in the far dug mostly by PTA in the far western panhandle. That's a Judy Bent site. And you can see these are just eroding into the water. They're being chewed in half. All you got is a little arc left of half of them. We don't know if this is really a ring. This seems to form a complete circle, but this half seems to be a Mississippian period, and this half seems to be a woodland period. It's very confusing. We don't know much about him. In 1974, Brose and Percy hypothesized a settlement for Weeden Island in this region. They suggested that the archetypal settlement pattern was on the coast was a ring midden attended by a family kin burial mound with nearby shell processing sites around it. And really at that time, the only map they had was this. And this was largely a Swift Creek midden. So they were saying, you know, this is just an hypothesis. We don't have all the data here, but this is our guess. And I think they made a pretty good guess, because as we've been exploring, these things are coming to prove their points. I'm not sure where I got this one out. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you here the great height of these Horace Island and especially the Fig Island. The heights of some of the larger rings. All these rings, the archaic rings, when you average them out, they average on about 2 meters high. And what's in them is clean shell. Now, Bob and I were having talking about what the heck is clean shell. Everybody uses it, but nobody knows what it is. I hypothesized if you have clean shell in these ring formations in the archaic, that they was put there fast and furious, and they didn't have time to gather dirt, soil, organic debris, because it was sealed off from further deposits. And it wasn't put there accidentally, because it's put in a ring shape. There's a purpose to the shape, and there's purpose to depositing it. So I've hypothesized that the reason for these tall middens are ring middens is, and this is, I just want to show you the tallest, this is the tallest one, this is 6 meters tall. That's a monster. And I think this one's, this is one of the shorter ones, that Bonita, yeah, that's one of the short, but that's been decimated by construction, so we really don't know the real height of it. And these all have mounds in them too. These are the only 3 with definitive mounds. You can see the mound here. It's actually attached by a causeway to the big ring right over here. These mounds are nearby and separate. And this is much like the Weeden Island pattern. But none of these mounds have been dug into enough to prove they're burial mounds. They have sand centers, but nobody's dug in them far enough to see if there's any burials in them. So that's a working hypothesis. And why only a few of them out of 60, why only a few have a mounds is another big question. Whereas only the biggest ones seem to have it, so maybe that has something to do with size. And this was a kin or moiety settlement where they buried their dead. Who knows? I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, where is that 6 foot tall?
That's in South Carolina.
6 meter tall.
6 meter tall, yeah. In fact, it's in great shape too, and nobody can get to it. It's hard to get to. It's incredible. In fact, the early archaeologists who explored this in the 70s, they walked out here and they said, oh, look at this. They did a topo map and say, hey, look at this. We got rings out here, and this one doesn't seem to be completely built. They were working on it or got eroded away or something. And then they say, oh, and there's a pile of shell over here. This is so massive when you get in, so jungle, you couldn't tell it was a ring until we did a map of it. It's just dense, dense thicket in there. And of course, very exotic species because it's shell in the middle of a marsh. But where was I at? So these are taller, and my proposed purpose was these formed feasting centers, and they were ceremonial centers, and that you don't get a lot of artifacts in these, and you don't get a lot of broken pottery, although it's there, and you don't get a lot of, you get hardly any soil debris at all because they're deposited very fast. Now, 2 things can deposit soil fast. One, you just process it and walk away. Other, you process it and you do something else and don't disturb it. And here's what I think. These are really processing sites, but they have ceremonial purposes. This is my hypothesis. It's been argued that's okay. People like to think of these circles as villages. I think they're right. In almost all of these U-shaped and these circle ones, at the archaic, at the very bottom little, before they started boiling on shell, there's a dark midden. Features, pit features, hearths, lots of broken pottery, everything you would find in what you'd call a living midden. And so once this shell starts piling up, they seem to abandon these sites and use them exclusively for feasting or processing shellfish. Just another view of it. I wanted to show you the locations of the mound. Like I say, three sites have mounds. It hasn't been confirmed that this is associated with this yet, because I think they dug a hole in there and they found human remain and they quit. So we don't have very little. I'm assuming it's that way because it's very close to Horse Island, and this ring here, which goes like this, kind of a C-shaped, had a mound right next to it. So the pattern is very similar. These are about 500 years apart. This is 4,500 and this is 3,900. And then the other mound here, which is the mound with the causeway here, and then multiple rings over here. I just wanted to show that the association of mounds to rings is consistent between the woodland and the archaic ring sites. Now, bring this up again, I just wanted to show the number of contours. I wish I'd put the contours on here. But this is Mound Field. This is something Willie discovered. This is one of the few sites Willie actually dug in the Panhandle. And he found 4 features, 4 little mounds with the central area absent. I think what this probably is, if you've done a little more probing, it's probably a ring midden. And we took some of his shovel test data in here, and we've interpolated it to be a ring midden. I'll show you a picture of that later with the nearby mound. Bird Hammock has a nearby mound, but it also has another mound down here. And so I think one of them is Weeden Island for sure. The other one might be an earlier Weeden Island. It's a little confusing. I'm not all clear on it. If anybody is, just let me know. And then this is the Bonita ring with that nearby mound. But you can see here, with the exception of Bonita, which has been leveled to the ground, you can see how it's real wide here and real narrow there. They've been pushing earth shell around all over there. These are pretty darn tall things. 6 meters there. The Horse Island is 4 meters deep at its deepest. It's got a mound 6 meters tall. Just quite a bit larger than these 20, 40 centimeter deposits you get of shell alternating with earth in what is typically a Weeden Island ring. And this is, oh yeah, I wanted to show you that just general height, the bird hammock compared to the exaggerated, of course, for effect, but it just shows you this is 3 or 4 times as big as those. And on average, they are quite a bit bigger, taller, although the shapes are similar. And here's just another example. This, keep in mind, this is not a topographic map. This is artifact distribution. I have since ceased using these colors because people get confused. But these are definitely topographic map, and these are barely discernible. 5 centimeter intervals, you know, you got 20 centimeters here. I think the deepest here was 50 centimeters. These are other kinds of rings, woodland rings, Weeden Island rings that, and Swift Creek, that people in the Northwest Panhandle area have been mapping for the last few years. Many of them are sketch map. This was one done by Doring at the Plantation West near Eglin Air Force Base, not on it, but near it. It's on the, I think it's on the Gulf National Seashore. He got a trail going right through the middle of it. And he found, this is unusual because he's the only one who's ever found this for sure, although I think we found it at Hare Hammock too, is the house mids. He interpreted these as house mids. And on one side of these house mids, he found a lot better artifacts, a lot cooler artifacts than the other. And he hypothesized there must have been a mound nearby here, and this was the living area of the mound keeper or the kin or the tribe that took care of that mound. And he bolstered that idea with there being lots of cool artifacts. This is the Third Gulf Breeze site. Here's the original sketch map of it. And then Doran went in there and did a shell distribution map. And that's what popped out here. And so you can see you got 50 centimeters of shell here. Maybe you go up to 70 at the deep. This is one of the deepest. But these, keep in mind, these aren't pure shell, and these aren't the clean shell that I've been talking about. These are shell with dark organic soils in them, filled with broken pottery, and alternating with shell deposits, soil, shell soil. And that's the mound ring I was telling you about earlier, the one that Willie dug. We put in a few more shovel tests and threw it into a program. And I'm not sure it's true, but we went out and looked at it. And it looks pretty good, I think. That's gone. They don't last long. And here's the bird. And here's the other mounds I was telling you about at Bird Hammock. Mostly a Swift Creek site. This one, that's another PTA site. You can see some of these are really, really pushing it. But I wanted to show you here that you get to base level of the mound, it's about 1 meter. You only get, even though this is recognized as one of the largest middens, I think, was it on Eglin? I forget. Near Eglin. And yet it's not very tall. Not very tall. And what's confusing about this one, there's multiple occupations. So you get Weeden Island, you get Deptford, you get Swift Creek. Who built what part of it is always, it's a bit confusing. This is another one. I think this is Old Homestead, a very small mound. It's ring only 50 centimeters across, being eroded near the bottom there by Gulf intrusion. And then I want to show you this again just for comparison to show you how tall and complex these archaic mounds were. So, in comparing these, trying to get a handle on what were these Weeden Island rings and mounds used for, I concluded that they weren't used for the same thing as archaic rings because of their internal structures. Obviously, they are lower relief, so in archaic sites, they're trying to mound up these things, mark territory, show how much they've eaten, brag about it to the people participating in the feast, brag about the people who are not participating, seal those people off. They form a wall, on many of these, you can form a wall so you can't see into them from the outside. And these are really monumental constructions, and the purpose of the feast, in part, is not only to feast and celebrate whatever they're celebrating, but to mark that feast with these big monuments and these ostentatious monuments. You don't get that in these Weeden Island rings. You can walk over a Weeden Island ring and you don't know you're there. People have noticed, hey, there's some shell on the ground here. Or there's little house middens all over the place. But they're little. And I think the woodland rings, because of that, are the epiphenomenon of living activities. They're living on here. They're not mounding it up. Once you start mounding it up, it's hard to live on that. You've got to keep moving your settlement. Not because you can't live on shell, and certainly people have and do today, but as these things build up higher and higher, the platform on top gets smaller and smaller. And some of the archaic rings, you couldn't possibly have a house on top of them. They're just too narrow on top, even today, when they've settled down. And the feasting here, I do not doubt, because all of these woodland mounds are close to, woodland rings are close to mounds. And there's a reason for that. Some of them have openings going towards the mounds. And I think they probably held feasts for the mounds, for the community, because these were community burial grounds, in the plaza of what might be a living village, or at least a living village when they're having these feasts for the mound. Because everything in that village seems to indicate living activity, the dark, dark soils. Some areas have, on one side, all the garbage is dumped, on the other, where you get nothing but broken pottery, suggesting that in some of these woodland rings, they're living there, but taking their shell and other organics onto the other side. Could be wrong on that, but that needs to be explored a little more. And so they're having ceremonies, both ceremonial features, but the other one is also a living area, the woodland ones. And I think what held these communities, both these communities together was their public scale, large scale monumental architecture. In the form of the woodland burial mounds, it's the burial mound itself that the people participate in, form, take care of, maintain. Whereas in earlier, mounds were very rare, and it was the large scale public architecture that integrated the archaic people was the actual ring itself. And that's just a summary of that. And then you compare that to Weeden Island. Now, where does Weeden Island fit in? If these are all Kolomoki, Weeden Island, and the Panhandle sites are all members of the same culture, why are their settlement patterns so different? Obviously, people have talked about this for years, and they suggested that the only thing that they have in common, or perhaps, or the main thing they have in common amongst this wide area of Weeden Island settlement are burial mounds, burial rites, and pottery manufacture, that they have some linkages in common there, but that settlements and other patterns may differ widely from that. I think they're probably right. These few slides show that. There's great differences among various regions that have Weeden Island pottery and burial mounds. And I want to suggest, you can see the large site of that Weeden Island site. This is another site in South Florida where we're starting to find these woodland rings that there's a large connection, although in terms of pottery and burial patterns, there might be a connection of the Weeden Island site to the more northern Weeden Island populations. I think that's also in terms of the use of a shell, there is a connection to the archaic past also in terms of mounding, but also to the...
Have you been